video and stuff, um, just so that after this we'll be able to share it with folks. Um, but yeah, so just kind of to get started, what is necessary dissent and what are we trying to do? We're really trying to be an organization that's dedicated to providing a platform for dissent against at all levels against the warmongering dangers and anti-people system that we find ourselves in. The US government and the corporate elite have proved that they will stop at nothing to carry out their brutal wars, regardless of the risks of nuclear conflict or the basic interests of the people. We absolutely cannot count on these politicians to do the right thing, and we can't just ask nicely for them to stop what they're doing. Politicians on both the left and the right have, at different times, positioned themselves in opposition to war and censorship. But in a wider view of those efforts to resist those policies, ultimately shows that these politicians all eventually play ball, and that despite token opposition, will ultimately carry out the bidding of the state and the corporate elite. Just take AOC, for example, a supposed leftist. Literally last weekend, she was promoting military recruitment at a high school in the Bronx. And those politicians who can't be bought off, who will be slandered, ridiculed, and ultimately forced out of politics. So again, we can't rely on these politicians to fix this mess. Only the organized force of the people standing together will be able to resist the constant beat of the war drums. And that being said, there's really barely any kind of organized and united anti-war movement in the US. And so that means today, like our urgent task is really to build that movement. And that's part of what we're trying to do here today, and specifically to focus on kind of anti-military recruitment. And before we actually get into that, we want to talk a little bit about like our current situation and why this is also necessary. I think one thing that all of us here today are aware of is the fact that the elite in this country are pushing us to the brink of nuclear war and putting the whole world and putting the people of the whole world in danger with their blatant provocations and geopolitical gambles. The US spent decades provoking Russia with NATO expansions further east and putting nuclear weapons directed at Russia and various NATO countries across Europe. The Euromaidan coup in 2014 that the US had its hand in pointed very clearly to the fact that what the US cares about is maintaining their own influence in Ukraine, not Ukrainian democracy or freedom. Now they're spending billions of dollars in supplying advanced weapons to Ukraine, and the US is essentially commanding Ukrainian HIMARS rocket attacks. The CIA is active in Ukraine, including on the front lines of the conflict. US politicians boast that the US is in it to win it and that there's no off-ramp for the conflict. And so the US has made good on these warmongering statements by sabotaging possible ceasefire agreements, and evidence strongly suggests that the US sabotaged the Nord Stream pipelines, contributing to inflation and economic havoc in Europe. And on the other side of the world, they're doing the same things when it comes to China. For decades, the rich in the US were more than happy to export production outside the country and into China in order to, one, break the labor movement, which was much stronger in the 60s and 70s than it is today, and two, exploit the Chinese people at a cheap rate. Yet when China began to threaten to outcompete the US economically, the US elite began to ring the alarm bells and began to talk about needing to rein China in. And the recent trade sanctions against China, as well as the recently finalized agreements on a new set of bases in the Philippines, just a few hundred miles away from Taiwan, are just the beginning. Top American generals, as well as top Chinese generals, are telling their respective countries to be ready for war over Taiwan by 2027. And so part of being ready for this is drumming up support for another senseless war and getting ready to clamp down on public dissent. And you know what? The New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, the Washington Post, and the rest of mainstream media have shown themselves to be eager cheerleaders for war and escalation and passing along Washington's wartime propaganda to the public without a second thought. After priming the US public for years with the Russiagate fabrication, the US think tank and NGO systems have gone into overdrive to manufacture evidence of Russian influence on campaigns in the US. They have also refused to publish stories about Seymour Hersh's well-researched article about how the US blew up the Nord Stream, and only now mention it in passing in articles where they tell the American public that US intelligence has magically just discovered evidence of a pro-Ukrainian, but non-state, not actually the Ukraine, actors blowing up the pipeline. Very suspicious. And yet somehow all the cries of revealing your sources disappear when the information is in line with the US state. Not only that, but basic dissent from the mainstream narrative has been cast as leftist, right wing, a conspiracy theory, or Russian propaganda. Even sharing basic information on the chemical disaster in Ohio has been declared spreading disinformation. So, more recently, the government has actually upped the ante, and an environmental activist, Aaron Brockovich, was put on a list warning Ohio law enforcement of potential terrorist threats because, and I quote, she was scheduled to be in East Palestine to explain residents' legal rights, and that she urged the community to use common sense and ask questions. And the government's assessment of this was that it could potentially increase tensions within the community. So perhaps if the government didn't want increased tensions, they shouldn't allow railroad companies to loosen regulations and cause chemical disasters. Yet what do? They clamp down on public dissent. And, in light of all of this, all of us should be incredibly concerned. Censorship, cries of national security, and war at the expense of the people have always gone hand in hand. In order to fight these things, we really need to be thinking about the larger picture and how all of these things are tied together. And I imagine that a lot of us here have very different ideas about how the system works and what the ultimate solution to all of this is. I myself believe that the underlying cause of these wars and various other problems that we see in society are part of the economic system of capitalism. And that as long as a few wealthy elites are controlling the economy, politics, and society at large, and as long as they continue to form competing blocs internationally and fight for dominance, there will be wars. But, I don't really expect that everyone here agrees with me, and that's okay. I hope that we'll be able to talk and discuss the nature of the problems that we're facing and work together. Because as long as we agree that there's a need to bring people together to fight and to bring people together and to build a fighting force against the war machine, we can work together. And in fact, there's a really big need for people who might disagree about a whole lot of other things to work together. And that's a real goal of necessary dissent. And so that's kind of it for the introduction. Next, we're going to be talking about recruitment with Jeff. So you're good.
Okay, thanks, Sam. So I'm Jeff. I am a Marine Corps vet and also a member of Veterans for Peace for the past 7 years now. So let me get into my presentation. So ever since the draft ended in the 70s, the military has had to rely on its recruiting efforts to keep bringing in new people. And if you're my age, you might think that this is limited to sending recruiters into schools and coming up with shiny new ad campaigns. But as the times have changed, so has the recruiting, and they're everywhere now. You may have heard in recent years about the ties between the military and Hollywood. Each branch actually has a liaison office to deal with Hollywood and help them make their films. But it doesn't stop with just having script approval, loaning out equipment, and letting Hollywood use locations. In recent years, recruiters have actually gone to movie theaters in the hopes of recruiting outside of movies like Captain Marvel and more recently Top Gun Maverick. They also have a big presence online. Each branch of the military has an esports team where they play various video games like Call of Duty and Valorant. Although the Marine Corps team isn't officially sanctioned, they do have a team, and many of these teams live stream their gameplay and they go to gaming tournaments. And last year, the military even put on its own video gaming tournament that was viewed by almost 1 million people online. The military is also all over social media with official accounts on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And in recent years, they've changed their ad campaigns, which you may have heard about, to try and attract a more diverse pool of recruits than they did in the past. So all of this is in addition to the more old school style of techniques, as I mentioned earlier, about sending recruiters into local high schools and college campuses. A few years ago, I was shocked to learn that recruiters were actually calling and texting high school kids out of the blue without those kids ever having signed up to be contacted by them. As it turns out, this is thanks to the No Child Left Behind Act and another act passed around the same time. And to quote from a Department of Education letter that was written a few years ago, both of these laws require local educational agencies receiving assistance under the ESEA, which stands for the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, to provide military recruiters upon request access to specific information and on a secondary school student. So the No Child Left Behind Act is what started it, but it was later updated under Obama by the Every Student Succeeds Act. And while previously kids were able to opt out of this on their own, um, now for the last 8 years, it has to be either their parents or they have to wait until they're 18. And this has to be provided in writing. Um, so while you can avoid recruiters in your schools for, that they're only there for a few hours and potentially opt out of getting calls and texts from them, some kids are being forced to interact with the military all the time. Excuse me. There was recently an article in the New York Times that exposed the fact that some kids are being automatically enrolled in JROTC, with some of these kids saying that they weren't allowed to drop the class. So for anyone who hasn't seen this article, which is from December, so not that long ago, but for anyone who hasn't seen the article, I just want to share a few things from it. So to quote the article, they say, schools have a financial incentive to push students into the program. The military subsidizes instructors' salaries while requiring schools to maintain a certain level of enrollment in order to keep the program. In states that have allowed JROTC to be used as an alternative graduation credit, some schools appear to have saved money by using the course as an alternative to hiring more teachers in subjects such as physical education or wellness. And actually, I just want to talk about that for a second, because in the article, they actually say that a lot of the places where these mandatory enrollments of JROTC is in lower income areas. So you can see the attractiveness of something like this if they can save money on salary in places where the schools are cash strapped because they're in lower income areas, and their funding comes from the local taxes. So you can see why this would be a problem. So another thing about that article, in the article, they also say that the Army itself states that 44% of all soldiers who entered its ranks in recent years came from a school that offered JROTC. So without these programs, the Army is in trouble. So you can see where it's mutually beneficial to both of them. Now, as if all of this forced interaction with the military and recruiters wasn't enough, the military has reportedly been lowering its minimum standards for acceptance and offering big bonuses in an attempt to boost their numbers. In June, the Military Times reported that the Army was offering up to 50,000 and the Navy was offering 25,000. And there was some discussion of increasing those bonuses if needed. Of course, I did see an article this morning where they rejected the notion of increasing pay for soldiers. At the same time, that article was just a few days old. This article talking about the bonuses is back from June. But anyway, Finally, I just want to say the War Institute at West Point is concerned that even if a draft was reinstituted in the US, it wouldn't be enough to fight a great power war the way that people are concerned right now, um, because it would take too long to get new forces in theater. Uh, Given that fact, as the Warhawks continue to push for war with China and Russia, we're going to see an even stronger push for recruits. With the defense budget increasing every year, the military has seemingly endless funds, and they have infiltrated nearly every segment of our society to push these endless wars and boost their recruiting efforts. That's why we need to be aware of all of the methods, new and old, that they're using to get people to sign up so that we can push back against the Warhawks by denying them the recruits that they need. So now I will hand it over to Alonzo to speak on how we can push back against the recruiters.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you for everybody who's here. And yeah, I'm Alonzo. I've been a part of some of this activism for a couple of years now here in Boston. So yeah, so you know, we heard from Sam about some of the larger picture, these escalations, this, you know, the drive towards greater conflicts and potentially world war with China and Russia. A bit from Jeff about how, you know, the kinds of tactics that the recruiters are using, and how those are only bound to ramp up as they, you know, desperately try to prepare themselves for, you know, an insane war with China. And so I'm hoping to, you know, yeah, talk a little bit about, well, given that context, you know, how can we kind of start organizing against recruitment? Yeah, in light of that context, and yeah, and then you know, I want to just give a couple ideas about, you know, the strategy and some tactics, but and then yeah, hopefully open up to discussion to hear from everybody else what you all think. Because I know there's a couple of people here who've started doing some of this work and who've been involved in it for a while. So I'm sure people will have a lot of good ideas and probably better ones than we do right now. But so anyway, yeah, to start off, so you know, like what's the point of this sort of work? And it seems somewhat obvious, you know, like the kind of the obvious and the immediate, the commonly held goal is, well, we want to be countering the recruiters' narrative, the military's narrative, and their lies. You know, informing the kids, the parents, the staff of these schools, et cetera, of the realities of the military. You know, the suicides, the insane suicide rates for active duty people, the insane suicide rates for veterans. I can't remember the figure, but it's very high. Telling them, you know, about the various other pretty terrible conditions, et cetera, to break the kind of illusion that the recruiters build up, you know, of how great it is to join the military. And you know, that's the kind of the obvious thing, and that's, you know, certainly true. We do want to be doing those things, but you know, I think we can and we need to be doing much more than just providing some information to counter these narratives. You know, especially in the current context, yeah, where yeah, the belligerence of this country's elite is growing, as are the possibilities of more conflicts and more wars and world war. You know, we have to approach, I think, initiatives like counter-recruitment as part of a larger strategy for fighting the elite and the system that they run. So how do we do that? How do we take specific outrages around, you know, these 17, 16-year-olds being stalked by these military recruiters and being, you know, having them show up at people's doors and texting them and having them be their, you know, coaches, et cetera. How do we take those um, uh, and link that up to the wider fight against the system, the wider fight against these escalations in Ukraine and against China, etc. So I think, well, first of all, beyond the informing about the lives of recruiters, we need to bring people into struggle. Bring like the students, the parents, the etc. Organize these people who by and large right now do not see themselves as activists. Do not see themselves as anti-war activists, but some of whom are really somewhat fed up with these things. They are fed up with their kids being stalked in these ways, and etc. So we have to really, focus on bringing them into the fight and not just kind of ourselves do a few things, but really try to draw people into being part of organizing and make, the students and parents into themselves an organized fighting force to take on these immediate outrages. But in the course of that fight and building that organization, we need to find ways to raise awareness about the larger picture that we've discussed throughout the event, to convince as many people as we can amongst these students and parents and whatnot, that there is a basis to fight the elite of our country and the system they uphold beyond just this immediate struggle. And that's a tricky thing because, in order to fight the specific outrages, we need to foster the widest possible unity we can, including with people who might never agree with, for example, the idea that there's anything wrong with what the U.S. is doing in Ukraine. We will find some people like that who are opposed to the stuff that their kids are being subjected to in the schools with the recruiters, but who won't agree, about some of these larger questions. And we have to find some way to still kind of draw them into the fight and unite with them where they do agree that, these recruiters shouldn't be doing this stuff and these schools shouldn't be handing over this information the way they are, etc. But, in the name, if in the name of fostering that unity, we totally give up on raising the larger questions, on raising awareness about the very nature of the military and of the wider schemes and maneuvers of the elite, and of really trying to raise people's consciousness of that this elite and that these maneuvers are fundamentally against their basic interests. I think we would be foregoing a key responsibility, because ultimately to defeat the system, in order to create a world where a small group of wealthy elites can't drive us towards gruesome wars and towards potentially even annihilation, it's going to require that a lot more people who don't see themselves as activists right now, and who come from a variety of backgrounds, it's going to require that a lot more people start to grapple with these larger questions, and that they start learning to come together to organize and to fight. And that is only going to happen if we deliberately kind of go into these efforts, consciously trying to make that happen, consciously trying to weave in the larger questions without, while still uniting with people who might not agree now and who might never come to agree about these things. And it's a lot easier said than done. And part of it is, you're always trying to do it, you kind of end up learning what works and what doesn't. But I think, if we don't come in with a plan to really try to do that, it's much easier to let that go by the wayside and to just kind of get stuck thinking about the narrow thing of like, well, we want to, counter the lie that the military is this great place where you will, be treated well, etc. So that's kind of, I guess, the larger scale kind of strategic, if you will, vision for how to go about this, how to link this up with the need for to build a wider movement. A couple of with one more point too. I think a key success of some of the efforts that have happened and that are ongoing on counter-recruitment has been the ability to draw in veterans into the movement. And then I think we need to really build off of that and further consolidate it. Because the more veterans come together and get involved, it's a pretty key thing, both because of the knowledge they have, but also, especially for younger veterans, the ability to relate to people who are active duty. And that part is key because, realistically, we're not going to stop the military from getting all the recruits it needs. We can make it complicated for them, and we can build up kind of organization that's able to give the military trouble, but we're not going to totally stop it. And so being able to draw in people and form links with active duty, I think it's important in the event of increased repression at home and worsening wars. The movement will need these links to get some section of people who are active duty to turn against their officers' orders the way they did in Vietnam, and the way that has happened in a lot of other, even World War I. A lot of there were mutinies of soldiers in Germany and then of course in Russia. So anyway, so just a couple, I guess, of these broader thoughts, and before kind of just jumping into the discussion and getting everybody else's ideas, I just wanted to throw out, a couple ideas about the specifics of kind of how to get this stuff started, maybe because it's a bit of a leap to go from kind of a large scale kind of understanding of what we're trying to do to then actually getting things off the ground. So just a couple quick thoughts. Next slide. The first problem is you've got to make some links to people to meet some of the students and the parents. So I think some of the stuff that various groups that have done this work do, of having kind of speaking tours at schools, is a useful way to start that. I think sometimes there's a danger of kind of making the organizing end up just get totally consumed in just the speaking tours, and we don't want to fall into that. But they are a useful thing to be able to bring, especially veterans, to talk to some of the students, to give them that perspective, kind of open things up. And just in line of what we've talked about the whole event, being able to do that while also, like posing some of these larger questions about the escalations going on and whatnot, I think is a useful thing to be thinking about doing. Next. And then, sometimes it might be challenging to actually get into a school if you don't have links yet. So one idea too is to try to do some talks in local churches where some of the parents might be going, and to raise some of these questions there as just an initial way to make some of the basic links that are necessary. Next. And then, like these public events, like the one that AOC held, I think are a good opportunity to not only to meet, some of the students and stuff that are going to these fairs, but also just to expose these politicians and their what frauds they are when they claim to be really progressive and for the people, and in the meantime they're feeding people into the military to be cannon fodder in the next big war. Next slide. And then a couple just quick thoughts about some of the key initial kind of outrages to maybe organize around, and this will depend probably on the specifics of different schools and whatnot. But I think the stuff with the covert recruiters is a pretty big thing. The fact that schools have substitute teachers and coaches and chaperones that are not employees of the school, but everybody thinks they're employees of the school, and actually they're just employees of the military and employed as recruiters, is pretty outrageous, and in situations where we do find that that's happening, I think it's something that people could be probably united around. And there's the JROTC stuff, of course. Next, the mandatory aspect, and then there's a lot of sexual assaults that have occurred in JROTC that's become a bit of a scandal. Even some of these politicians who I think are just posing mostly, but even the scandal has forced some of them to even like raise a possibility of scrapping the JROTC program, while we wait for the military to fix it or something. And I don't particularly trust them when they make these calls, but I think it is does indicate a bit the level of the degree to which this is a scandal that could be organized around. Next. And yeah, there's all these things that schools do of like not telling people that they can opt out of having their kids' information sent to the military, and they're technically supposed to do that, but they often don't. So that can be an initial thing and then something that is not so hard to have a victory on, and that can hopefully be used to build up people's sense that they can kind of wage some struggle and win some victories, even though it would be a small thing to get the schools to, but it is good to define kind of small things that are not so hard to win in order to build things up. Next. And then longer term, I think dealing with these federal laws that require these schools to be giving us information is something to build up. And if we can kind of link up these struggles in various school districts across the country, that's a target to keep in mind. But in the course of all of this, you just again gotta try to be holding these two different things at once. One, is moving forward the specific campaigns that are on specific outrages like these, but then combining that also with, in the course of that, kind of raising the larger questions to people who get involved in the struggle, and to as many people as is possible, get them to see that the basis to fight things beyond just these initial kind of narrow outrages. Next. And then, and one last thing before just opening up for discussion. There's been a lot of, there's been some uptick in kind of some organizing on various university campuses around against military recruiters and weapons manufacturers and whatnot. And I think it provides a bit of an opportunity. One, some of the students in these campuses, a lot of them aren't local, but some of them invariably are. And we've already met a couple people here in Boston who've gotten involved in some of these movements on campuses and who are from the area and who, have been able to inform us a lot about the dynamics going on at their high schools. So it's useful for that, but also, being able to get some of these students who are kind of waking up to the needs of the post-war machine off their campus a bit, and get them kind of thinking about things beyond the scope of, their university. I think it's a good opportunity to advance things both in the, high school organizing and in the campus organizing, and more broadly, it's like, advancing this movement overall. So there's been a couple, specifically in like Tufts here, and in Amherst and in Western Mass, and across the country, various groups that have started to take this up. So if we can, link up with those efforts and bring some of those people into this organizing, I think it's a good thing to be a useful thing. So anyway, I've talked too much probably. So I just want to, open things up for discussion. I think Sam will say a couple things before.
Yeah, cool. So thanks, Alonzo and Jeff. If anyone has kind of any general thoughts or questions on the presentation, we thought we'd kind of open it up for that first before getting into some questions later. Um, there's probably enough of us where it does make sense to, if people know like the raise hand function, um, would perhaps be helpful. Um, though also people can just start talking, I think. Um, so
Oh, do a video, do a video. Well, I'd like to say something. Can you hear me?
yep, I can hear you.
I don't know if you can see me, but you can hear me.
There we go.
Okay, so I'm Nancy Goldner, and along with Rosemary Keene, we're from the Racial Justice Indigenous Solidarity Working Group of Mass Peace Action. And it was the two of us who recently organized a webinar on counter-recruitment with Rick Junko from Project Yano in California, which is a group looking to provide information for youth in terms of alternatives to the military, and also the National Network Opposing the Militarization of Youth. Gary Girardi was, who's their communications person, was the other panelist. At any rate, out of that, and as well as that article in the Times, we're going to follow up with a leafleting at East Boston High using the palm card put out by the War Resisters League, specifically directed to high school students. So so that will be on April 26th, and I can put my email in the chat. So folks, if they want to take part or want to know more, can get in touch with me. And I wanted to comment, though, that although I agree that there's a larger context, and it is the incredible militarization of our whole civilian lives and the Pentagon's reach and the endless wars that are being conducted without our consent, that you're all pointing to, that is driving this aggressive recruiting. But I feel that at this moment, that it's important to just reach out directly to the youth who may not see an alternative to a future for themselves. So 80% or so of the students at East Boston High are from Hispanic background, and it's a low wealth community. So they are, ripe for being cannon fodder because they are being seduced by the offers the military is making. So I think it's a good place to start. I'm not sure how much I can reach the parents at this point. So we're going to stand outside the school and hand these things out. And that'll be a start. And maybe then we can get a conversation going. But I just wanted to raise that question that, that I'm not sure we can get to the larger questions as is being called right now. And so we're starting at very, very local level. Any thoughts from the panel?
Yeah,
Well,
no, thank you for that, Nancy. And also, yeah, I unfortunately wasn't able to make the panel that you all hosted, but I heard that was pretty interesting.
Well, I think we have a recording up on our YouTube channel.
Yeah, I've been meaning to check it out. And I do think it is kind of like a big question of yeah, how are you able to do the bigger thing? And I think oftentimes as well, talking about the larger scale picture can help out with the local stuff that you're doing. And that, I think students are, like I'm pretty close to high school age at this point, but people are pretty concerned about what they're going to do with their futures. And I think there's a lot of people kind of my age and younger that are pretty depressed about the way that things are looking. And so I think, a lot of people are looking for an alternative. And, a lot of people might just not see that there's like an ability to fight some of that stuff. I don't know if anyone has any other thoughts, but otherwise Will's raised his hand.
I was just going to say to Nancy, it was a good point you brought up, and it was something I didn't include with my presentation, is just, the fact that you brought up, like, these offers are very enticing to a lot of people, with tens of thousands of dollars bonuses up front from the Army. One of the techniques, which is kind of a unofficial technique that they use for recruiting, is the poverty draft. So, you have these JROTC programs going into, like I was talking about that article earlier, where they go into schools where it's people who are in, low economic areas. And then you have the JROTC programs come in, and you have people say, oh, well, if you want to continue this, we can give you $50,000 bonus if you join the Army. That's going to look pretty attractive to them. So I didn't include that, but that is, it is a good point.
Yeah, could I jump in?
Yeah, go for it, please.
Yeah, what's up, everyone? My name's Will. I am unfortunately a veteran of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. I've been in the peace and anti-war movement for a decade now. Almost, have done a lot of things with almost all the peace and anti-war organizations across the country, at least the national ones. Yeah, appreciate the presentations. I really appreciated the points that y'all make. I think that goes a little bit deeper than the typical peace organization, especially on how to widen the struggle against the wars and connecting them to like structural problems at home. Yeah, so I guess my question is kind of tied to some of the things that was just said. I wonder, because I've done a lot of counter recruitment in low income schools, and let's face it, it's basically all Black or brown schools, and sometimes it's really hard to talk to them about to have a message of saying to not join the military while learning about some of the conditions that they are in, that they're living through. And so, like Jeff was saying, $50,000 bonus, health, like you sign a piece of paper, healthcare, dental, place to stay, 3 meals a day, just immediately you get that, compared to conditions where you may have, you're struggling to get food on the table, but you may have a family member that is sexually assaulting you. You got gun violence, you got all these things in the hood. So it's really hard to come with that message to be like, don't join the military. And so I wonder what y'all's perspective is on this, maybe to go a little bit deeper. Have y'all discussed it? Because there's no other organization or institution that can beat the so-called benefits that the military hands out overnight. And that's like a really big core component that I don't see any other peace organization really addressing when it comes to counter-recruitment efforts. It's only just on this moral ground. It's a bad thing to do and you shouldn't do it, without understanding like the material conditions that why people were joining in the first place. So just want to throw that out there. If you don't have an answer, that's fine. But just wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like kind of, I mean, you have different politicians and top kind of military people saying like very explicitly like that's how they're getting more recruits, and that's what they need to focus on. And after like the Biden kind of student debt repealment stuff came out, there was all this like uproar about like this is going to hurt military recruitment because now people won't feel the need to go to the military to be able to pay for college. So I think if we're not kind of addressing that question, like we're not going to be able to do this very effectively. The hard part, I think, is kind of like showing, yeah, an alternative when, there is pretty, high unemployment, and not a whole lot of good kind of other job options for people. I think that's, part of why we see it as so important to talk about the larger system that we find ourselves in, and to really kind of say, like, look, it's not just the fact that, like, we're going to tell you don't join the military, war is bad, because we see that there's other reasons why people are being pushed into that, um, and we have to kind of open people's eyes up to the fact that, uh, yeah, in order to fight this stuff, I think we need to be also trying to fight the fact that, like, yeah, the government's allowed to push the military as the one thing that gives people health care, that does all these other things. Um, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. Yeah, that's a good point to connecting it to a larger, the systems at home, the problems at home. Yeah, yeah, that's something to think through for sure.
I don't know if Alonso
So-
or Jeff has any points, but then after that's going to be John, and then Miles, and then Rosemary.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, like, to your point, Will, I think um part of this whole discussion uh needs to be, like what we were saying earlier, is we need to build a broad base. And I think the reason for that is we need to reach out to other organizations, like you were saying, that it's typically just like coming from a moral standpoint that we shouldn't do this. But I think we need to reach out to other organizations like the Poor People's Campaign. Um, I don't know if they've changed their name, but back in the day, it used to be the Fight for 15, but even $15 an hour isn't enough anymore. But people trying to address other issues, because I don't know about you, when I enlisted, um, I consider myself part of that poverty draft that I was talking about. I was working a job where I was not making much money. I hadn't had health insurance for 3 years or so. Um, and it was before Obamacare. So, like, now we have Obamacare, and that's good and all. It got more employers to offer health insurance than were previously, but there's still employers that don't offer it. Um, but like, this is part of the reason, I would say, why people fought back so hard against Bernie calling for Medicare for all. Well, if you give people Medicare for all, then that takes away part of the argument to join the military. Um, Andrew Yang in 2020 was bringing up the proposal for universal basic income. If you start giving people UBI, you're not going to have as much of a attraction from the poverty draft aspect. And I mentioned there was an article that I saw just this morning that's from a couple days ago, and it's in the Military Times, where they were saying, we're going to raise, maybe we'll raise the bonuses, but we're not going to raise the basic pay for the military. And there's a quote in here where it says, defense officials said they want to study it further. And then there's a quote where it says, we've done reviews of this and found that if you do a job in the Navy or Marine Corps and do the same job in the private sector, on average, the people doing the job in the military earn more, said Eric Raven, Undersecretary of the Navy. But that's not really true. The military gets paid shit. Pardon my language. But the reason they get away with that is because, oh, well, we're going to factor in the healthcare that we give them. We're going to factor in the housing. We're going to factor in the meals. So as low as pay is in the private sector for a lot of people, it's it's not better in the military. It's that they're counting in these benefits that they give you in the military. And if you take those benefits away, then people um, won't be as attracted to the military. So yeah, I agree with you. We do need to um, branch out and start working on some of these other things to chip away at that economic draft.
Just a quick thought, and I want to give it a chance. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a big thing to grapple with. And I mean, on one hand, you know, like there is, yeah, like Jeff was remarking, there's some kind of things that the military says that aren't really so true about how great the benefits are. But we also can't, you know, and we should you know be trying to like expose those exaggerations and lies and whatnot, and but yeah, realistically, I mean, there are situations people find themselves in where like you know, even as bad as some of these supposed benefits are relative to what, you know, they're made out to be, it's still better than the situation they're in right now, and we can't kind of pretend that that's not true. But I think you know, even with all that said, like there are still people out there, including economics parents, that you know are, you know, aren't happy about their kids being shown that as the only option. And we're not going to be able to stop everybody who's considering this stuff from joining, but I don't think that should be the main goal. But to like really like look for those people, and there will, you know, in one specific school there might not be so many, in another there might be some more that are really like, you know, yeah, our situation is tough, but I don't want that, you know, like it's messed up that the society is driving my kid towards this, and if we can find those people and like turn that discontent into something that they start organizing around, yeah, we're not going to put an end to all the recruiting, because we can't, you know, right now just address all the problems that are leading to that. Like we can't solve the problems in the society and the economic system right now ourselves that are leading to the draft. That'll take, you know, building up the movement much more broadly, and really, yeah, transforming the society much more broadly, and that'll take a lot more time. But we can start to yeah, build some of that organization, and by having, I think, some of the broader perspective, it'll help with that. And if we see that as a key thing, and not just kind of stopping each individual who's considering joining from joining, um, I think that helps a little bit to have that other perspective instead.
Cool. John, you're up.
Okay. Hi, I'm John. I'm John. I live over in Chelsea. We have an organization over there called Chelsea Uniéndose en contra de la guerra, which is Chelsea uniting against the war. We started doing the counter-recruiting in 2004, and we did it for about 17 years. The last 3 years, we really haven't done a serious effort due to COVID, but essentially, you know, we did like some of the other folks here, passed out literature in front of the high schools in the beginning, that is, until we got inside the high school. But essentially, the literature talked about, you know, what the recruiters and the military are saying versus what the facts are. And you know, I can go into more of that later, but generally we did it in the fall because that's when the recruiters are given the names of the students, and so if they opt out in the fall, then they don't get bugged by the recruiters. But this is, you know, in terms of the big picture, I think back then in '04, there was, you know, a war with boots on the ground in a major way going on, and that makes the atmosphere different than what you see today in a war which I consider, you know, fairly popular in terms of the overall population, the war being waged against Russia. And that, generally, we haven't been able to mobilize many people against the current war that's being conducted by the war makers in Washington. So that has to be taken into consideration in terms of a big general picture. I think most of the opposition to the war against the Russians in the Ukraine, the proxy war, is coming from conservatives, right-wingers. I could be wrong. Maybe folks can address that. But that's what I see anyway. And also, we're in the context of an anti-war movement, in my opinion, that has deep divisions right now. And so that, right now, that's those bigger questions, I think, are worth addressing in terms of doing counter-recruitment work around the country and broadening that effort. And then maybe, later, I guess we're going to talk about specifics of counter-recruitment, and we can delve into that a bit more.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I agree, I think that there's been a lot of propaganda around kind of, this time the US has involved itself in a war that is just. And, that this time it's different than all of the other wars that we've been involved in. And I think the propaganda machine is really good. It's a well-oiled machine that can be really difficult for people to fight. And I agree also with your point that, like, right now, the anti-war movement is pretty divided, and that a lot of kind of the anti-militarist sentiment has been coming from the more like traditionally conservative, traditionally conservatives, and that there's actually a real need for us to unite with those people as well who see the need to kind of protest and fight against the kind of recruitment and military. In February, there's the Rage Against the War Machine protest that a few of us here went to, and we talked to a lot of people who are definitely conservative libertarian, but were very concerned about what was going on. And I think there's a need for us to be able to find ways to work together with people, like I said earlier, that disagree with us on a lot of different points. And I think that that's not a strength that the anti-war movement has right now, that I think we need to build.
Could I address one thing quickly? The question I think is being debated across the country is the question of whether this is a just war or not. And I'll just leave it at that. I have a different view of that. All right.
Rosemary?
Yes, thank you, Sam. Hi, everybody. Well, as Nancy mentioned, she and I had worked together on the webinar several weeks ago on opposing the militarization of youth. And Nancy recently found from the website at the East Boston High School that the mission, thinking about the lies and the misrepresentation of the military to students, this is what they have there as the mission of the junior ROTC program, which says nothing about war or fighting or death or suicide, of course. It just makes it sound like it's a wonderful program that you would want your child to be signed up for, make them a better citizen, and help them with self-esteem and other things like that. So I think when Nancy and I have talked about leafleting there outside the school, that's kind of how I'm seeing it, that basic message that the problem with junior ROTC is that they don't tell the truth. And I think it's pretty remarkable that these bonuses are having to be offered. It shows us that most young people do not want to join the military. The poverty draft is definitely a reality, but even in the face of that, we have, what is it, 40% almost of the population that are poor, but they're not signing up for the military. So I think that's kind of a hopeful reality to focus on. And traditionally, before Obama, it was, I have read that it was true that Black families generally were the least supportive of US wars. So we can, I think we can remind ourselves that people are paying attention. And though some do decide to go into the military, there's a lot of potential for helping to develop a movement against joining the military. If we could somehow find more volunteers to do the counter-recruiting work. John, it was very interesting to hear about your efforts. I'm a member of Dorchester People for Peace, and we used to do counter-recruiting also, but we fell out sooner than you did from doing that. And it's good to be reminded that in the fall is when the opting out needs to happen. And so we need to be active then to help students and parents realize that they can do that. And I also wanted to say that, yes, organizing with the Poor People's Campaign and Fight for 15 and groups like that who are very much working with frontline communities, I think that's important for us as we go forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rosemary. And I think, yeah, it's always a good point to try to, well, one, I think learn also from other people and the things that they've been doing. I think again that's part of why like we wanted to put together this panel, as well as to share some of our own initial thoughts, but to not kind of say that like we have all the answers, but really to try to spark some conversations with people about their thoughts and their experiences too. Yeah. So,
I think Miles has his hand raised.
Sorry, Miles, go for it.
All good. I'm actually still mulling over everything everyone said. I feel like a lot's been said and put on the table, which is great. As I was just thinking about something that has been mentioned a couple times, but I guess I'll just repeat it because I'm still thinking about it, which is sort of this relationship between anti-recruitment and raising people's consciousness about the US war machine, and sort of how we're really trying to do both, and sort of how they reinforce each other. Yeah, and I guess maybe for people that have been involved in sort of anti-recruitment, maybe a question is sort of, how often do the campaigns you guys are working on, how often do they sort of emphasize sort of, raising a larger consciousness about the sort of the US war machine, and not just the specific reasons that, maybe not always specifically about US coercion of students, but also more largely the reasons that the US needs to do this. Because that feels very important in terms of not just, really helping people understand why they shouldn't join the military, but also more largely why we need to be opposing the US military altogether. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, because, there's not just like the, so obviously moral, don't join the military because war is bad type of things. I think people do kind of need to grasp kind of like, well, and do kind of question like, why is it constantly that war is happening, and what to do with that. And something that I didn't mention after Rosemary spoke, but that she was saying like, look, like military recruitment is at a somewhat low level. They're not able to meet their goals. And I think that that's true, but the risk is always that can change if we do find ourselves in a situation where the US is going to war. Because I think, historically we've always seen in those situations where recruitment actually really ramps up because people do believe in like what the US government says that we're fighting for. And so I think the goal is really to be able to try to build some organization to be prepared for when that does happen, as well. And yeah, like Miles was saying, it's absolutely part of being able to look at that larger picture. There were two hands raised at approximately the same time. I don't know if either, actually, I think it might have just been you, Will. All right, go for it.
Yeah, I wanted to respond. I think it was Miles that said something about counter recruitment work, especially in high schools with my experience. On the one hand, it's been hard through some of the organizations that do the counter recruitment and set it all up. They don't want too much of a radical message to be said. At the same time, the teachers can also, if such a radical message is to be said, the teacher will have repercussions on them, because our school districts have a funny way of kind of weaseling out the radical message or a message of the reality of the situation in our country: capitalism, racism, sexism, all that stuff, right? So I don't know, that's something that popped into my head while Miles was asking about some of the experiences with counter recruitment.
Yeah, it's really a hard needle to thread, when it comes to this because we want to be able to work with a broad group of people, that have very different ideas about what's going on, but at the same time, it is so important to be able to talk about like these bigger pictures. And I mean, I think that though if you know how to like phrase things, there's a lot of unity that people that like maybe appearance wise it would seem that they wouldn't agree on a lot of things. And I think part of part of some of this is also trying to find, yeah, what that unity is. And I think you can also talk about like these larger scale picture of things of like, I think a lot of people that maybe during, for example, the Iraq War, who would have been completely in support of it, now looking back, kind of can see like, oh, that really didn't make sense to do, and it really wasn't just about democracy and freedom and fighting terrorism, like the U.S. was saying. And so if we're able to kind of draw in some of that kind of feelings that people have and thoughts about it, and also not just try to, I think, tell people like this is a bad system, but to draw people into conversations and to draw people into thinking about these things, I think that it can somewhat be more effective as well, because ultimately too, it's like we want people to be thinking about what's going on around them. And really, like, if people are thinking about these bigger pictures, like they're going to come to their own conclusions. And it's absolutely a good thing for us to be able to point people in a certain direction. But I think that, yeah, that can definitely help people, I think, who might otherwise feel like they want to just disagree with you outright. um, I don't know if Jeff or Alonzo have something to say, but otherwise, Joyce, go ahead.
Just one quick thing to add on to that. I think that was all very well said. And also, there definitely will be limits to, like, in a kind of school sanctioned event, to what things we might be able to say. But also part of the point of doing those is to, make the links that we can in order to also hold meetings outside of just school sanctioned things. Hopefully, if we can get some organizing going, we'll be having, meetings with the parents and stuff that aren't like official school meetings, and or we can, talk more openly about different things too. And it'll probably take, it's not an easy thing to get to that place, but I think it is something to try to be aiming for if we are gonna, like we were talking about, bring people into the struggle. We can't just rely on the things we're able to do at the schools and official events and talks.
Yeah, absolutely. Joyce?
Yeah, I was just like, I've been thinking about how exactly to go about, raising some of these like larger questions to people. And I think Will said it, like you can't just like go out and say like, you know, some more radical things, especially in like a school setting or with people who maybe don't agree. But I think it is important to like be like, okay, so like for example, the No Child Left Behind Act is supposed to be an act that like makes sure that children like get the education they need. Like, what does it say about like our government that, you know, there's something slipped in there to like get these kids into the military and you know, face like these horrible things that happens when you go into the military. Like what is our system about if like this is like, you know, something targeted at children? And yeah, like sorry, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's, I think, so many different examples that like can be so helpful in framing all of this stuff that doesn't necessarily need to be couched in like radical language that kind of might take people like aback a bit. And yeah, finding good examples of how to point that out, I think, you know, are key, and also will just depend on the people that you're talking to. Because I think also a big part of this is just being able to adapt to like the different ideas that people have.
Not sure, maybe in 20 minutes or so.
I don't know where the hand raise thing went. I can't find it, but I'd like to. Yeah. Yeah, I think, well, one thing I was thinking when Will was talking was that it could make sense that if people know teachers in their area who would be amenable to having some of these, you know, anti-recruitment conversations, and even more specifically to us really talking more largely about, yeah, the U.S. war machine and kind of what underlies the need for the military to recruit in these coercive ways. If there is an issue with sort of, you know, teachers, you know, being retaliated against, it could make sense to be having conversations with teachers that we know who would want to do this kind of thing anyway. I can think of actually one in Boston, and I went to Brookline High, so I could definitely reach out to some teachers in Brookline as well. But just putting that on the table, if people know teachers or think that could make sense to try and talk to some teachers. And the other thing, I guess, too, that's sticking out in my head is that, you know, in sort of talking about this coercion that takes place when recruitment is happening by the military, that there are sort of these, someone mentioned like kind of secret recruiters in schools, like teachers who aren't publicly known as recruiters, but are being paid, I think, by the military. Maybe someone can fill the holes in there. But once again, sort of, you know, teachers really care about their students, and I think would definitely, you know, good ones would definitely want to unite on this. So I think they could be people to look to bring into the fold, and talk a little bit more about anti-recruitment stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't know so many details. I mean, yeah, there's been some articles that have been written about, yeah, how these recruiters become the chaperones and substitute teachers, and you know, coach the sports, et cetera, and aren't publicly like, you know, aren't known to be official recruiters. It seems to be a somewhat widespread thing, but yeah, but certainly, yeah, I think you're right. Definitely, like trying to bringing some of the teachers to the fold, and definitely, you know, if people know teachers in a particular area, yeah, reaching out and trying to see if there's interest in this sort of thing is definitely a useful thing. And then just want to make also a comment about some of the stuff Joyce was raising, and that others have raised about, yeah, this question of putting larger questions on the table. Part of it too, I think, is, in addition, I mean, yeah, but part of it is also listening, you know, like so learning from people, like listening to like what are people, because this society pushes us to turn our brains off in a million different ways, and there's some degree of success with that, but also people's brains aren't totally turned off. People are really do, you know, are aware of some aspects of things going on and are to varying degrees upset, even if they don't have a clear notion of you know, why things are going the way they're going, or whatnot. And people will have some insights and stuff. And so being able to like draw out people's ideas about, you know, both the immediate questions of, you know, what's going on with their kids, with their students, etc., with these recruiters, and then also drawing their ideas about more widely the society is a key way, I think, to then like figure out how to you take the things that they're already thinking about and make larger kind of exposures of what's going on in the society. Take like, these immediate outrages that they're already upset about, with like the rampant sexual assaults in JROTC, for example, just one thing, and then in the course of kind of trying to build some organizing around that, and getting their ideas about that and about what's behind that reality, make exposures to the larger system of why it is these sexual assaults are so rampant in the military and in the society, etc. So it's one thing that I was thinking about there.
Yeah. Also, this is just a comment to the like note that you sent in the chat, Will. But yeah, I mean, I think it's so difficult if you only have one conversation with someone. Like one conversation is not really enough to change people's minds about a lot of things. Like you can spark some things and hopefully they'll think about it, but I think it really is like, it can't just be a one-off thing, especially when like if military recruitment is like consistently happening at schools and stuff. So I think, yeah, part of the real goal of really kind of trying to build some organization, and to do that in high schools is then also somewhat difficult too, to try to do that through parents, and because ultimately like you have to involve high schoolers in this fight, and it does not make so much sense to just walk into a high school and be like, hey kids, don't join the military. So to find ways of being able to build organization that also includes the students themselves, I think is pretty important, and yet can also be, I think, somewhat tricky to do.
Yeah, I want to respond to that real quick. It's just, I'll spend an hour with either university or high school students, and like a lot of people will change their views. They're like blown away at the information that I give them because it's part personal experience and part just basic information about what the U.S. military is doing around the world and how it's connected to the U.S., racism, sexism, sexual assault in the military. I talk about all that. And a lot of people are really just like blown away. And there's tons of kids that are like, I'm not joining the military anymore. But it is like a one-off thing. Then it's like, okay, I did whatever. And then I wish at all these schools that I spoke to, whether it's in New York or Philly or somewhere else, and a lot of it since the pandemic has been online, I wish I could tie them to organizations on the ground to really push it a little bit further, right? Because if 1 hour does change them a lot, where like we get feedback afterwards because the teachers are asking them, what do you think about the presentation? And a lot of people, they're like, I didn't believe it, but I looked it up and everything was true. This is crazy. And so like, that transformation is really hard in this country, culturally speaking, politically speaking. But if we could do it when they're young, and if 1 hour really impacts them that much, if you're not organizing with them afterwards, like it just, all that energy just goes, it's probably going to go in the Democratic Party. Let's just face it.
Yeah, no,
that's a key point.
Oh, sorry, Alonzo.
No, I just I'm done. I was just saying that.
Yeah, and I mean it's really kind of then a question of how do you harness that energy, and I mean it's great to see that like you're really able to change people's minds, and I mean I think it points to the fact that a lot of people aren't exposed to like just some basic information about what's going on, and points to the real kind of opportunity for us to actually be able to present some basic facts and to be able to counter just like the blatantly false narrative that like most people are given. But yeah, then it's kind of like, and so what's the next step of that? And I mean, I think right now it's kind of at a point where we'll be able to hopefully build up a bit of organization in a couple different places, and if possible, able to connect people through that. Also, if I know that I think Nancy sent her email in the chat, but if anyone else would like to send their email as well so that we can kind of continue this conversation as well. Just wanted to put that out there, not to like stop the conversation or anything, but just before I forget to say that.
I wanted to add something
Yeah,
in
please.
terms of the larger question. I don't know if you can't see me, but in any case, so once I was at a community fair in Grove Hall, which is a low wealth neighborhood in Boston, and a woman came up. I was and asked, "Well, what does this have to do with me?" Because it was about the size of the military budget. Well, that's a way to make the link that says if we weren't spending all that money on arms and armaments and our 800 military bases around the world and our endless wars, think about how that money could benefit your community. So I think that would be a way to reach parents in particular. Who knows, a presentation with the PTA perhaps about this might be useful. I'm just thinking. The War Resisters League has a great pie chart which shows how much money is going to the military. And so that's a resource. That's a way to make one link aside from really understanding how militarism drives our foreign policy. Make it very concrete in terms of how that money could really, that's being used to support that policy, is depriving people of basic kinds of lives that we could really offer everybody, as somebody pointed out, universal health care, basic income. Right? So I would want to point people to that as a link, a useful link.
Yeah, no, for sure. More resources.
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave, so I want to thank everybody for their wonderful feedback and insights.
That's great. Yeah, thank you so much for being here, Nancy. And yeah, more information is always super helpful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to the. Well, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've honestly already covered this question a little bit. I think, well, actually, so somewhat of a fair bit, but figured I'd put it out there again. Yeah, like, you know, what are perhaps some of the specific ways in which that, you know, we can really counter these bigger ideas, and you know, yeah, if anyone had any final questions on that or final ideas, I guess maybe. Um, yeah, because otherwise, you know, I think what we're trying to do with this is to, uh, you know, forge some links with people, and to, you know, maybe those of us in Boston, to really concretely do something. Kind of next steps, I think, be great for some of us to join Nancy and Rosemary flyering, and you know, to otherwise kind of, you know, not just talk about it, but really get the ball rolling.
Yeah, I guess maybe to put it on the table again, just trying to see if there are any teachers that we know locally that would be interested in having us talk to some students about anti-recruitment efforts, or maybe once again, just to come back to people that have done it. And you know, is in the past, has it been how have you sort of been introduced to classrooms in terms of starting to talk to students, and how does that ball kind of start rolling? Because in my head right now, it is sort of like a, you know, maybe I don't know any teachers over here, but I do know some, like I said, in Boston and Brookline, and maybe reaching out to them to talk to some of their students. And yeah, I don't know, how does the ball sometimes get rolling in some of these efforts?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm pointing at you kind of, Will, sorry. Or John, I know John was saying he was involved too. So anyone that has
Yeah, I guess I'll just go real quickly. Yeah, you know, the organization kind of comes in and says, hey, listen, the military is a big part of this society. There's a lot of views that we're gonna present you with that is not in the norm. They ask the students to think critically about all this stuff. Don't take our word for it. You can check this stuff out online. They ask about questions, you know, for students to think about morality and think about who is a friend, who is an enemy type stuff. And then I kind of the veterans kind of come in and tell their own story. And I think some veterans, they just go in and kind of just tell their personal story. And, you know, that really connects with a lot of people. Myself, I don't like to talk about the personal stuff. I think it's quite boring, but it does connect with people. And then I kind of do a PowerPoint presentation that has like, I think I would argue really good slides and images of, you know, military bases, military spending, militarization of police forces, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. I don't know if that helps.
No,
Yeah.
it definitely does.
Could you repeat what organization you're in again? I know you said it at the beginning, but I missed that. Well,
Well, what organization I don't know. I'm in a couple organizations, I guess, but the counter recruitment stuff,
yeah,
it's called We Are Not Your Soldiers.
we are not your soldiers. Okay.
Familiar with this?
I haven't heard of them before.
Yeah, I've heard of them and seen some of the
I've
stuff. I
I've
think
heard of
it's-
them.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. And yeah, just real quick, you know, I asked you in the chat about MLK Jr. Like that they were mentioned in the New York Times article that they believe that MLK Jr. is one of the schools where they're forcibly enrolling people in there. And I know like my cousin actually taught at MLK Jr. a few years ago before they turned it into a charter school. And like, you know, they're in Germantown, which I don't know like how long you've been living in Philly, how well you know the area, but like for anyone that doesn't live around there, Germantown is a low income area. And you know, my cousin would tell us that they never had for his class that he taught, he never had enough books to give to his students to actually assign them homework. Any homework that he would theoretically assign them, they had to do in class. So like that's obviously like that's a prime example of the kind of schools that they target with these programs.
Yeah.
I sort of a little bit not totally related to what you were talking about, but you know what Miles was saying about reaching out to some teachers. One of the biggest things that we're gonna have to do to really give this thing like you know, like to have whatever organizing we're doing last for a while is you know, get people on these high school campuses or in the buildings, like really start themselves organizing, which that's like pretty tough. But I just remember like, you know, there's been a million talks I've had to go to it when I was in high school about, I don't know, whatever like random organization was coming in, and you could certainly get involved, but it was always outside of the school. And you know, it's not like we were just going to be able to set up a anti-recruitment club at the school. But there, you know, I think at least when I was in high school, there were like a few people who, when military recruiters would come, would always like sort of talk about how this is strange, make fun of them. Probably wasn't the most constructive, but I mean, yeah, just really forming a solid base of people to work with at those schools too, combination teachers and students.
Yeah, absolutely. John, you have your hand raised.
Yes. The way we started out, we didn't really have a lot of, this is in 2004, the war is raging in Iraq. So, you know, we didn't really have teachers on the inside or anything like that. We printed 1,000 flyers with in English on one side and Spanish on the other of what I mentioned earlier. You know, what the recruiters in the military tell you, and these are the facts. And then we'd have an opt-out form, make 1,000 copies of that, and then the flyer and the form you give to each student coming in. You need, I don't know, about 8 people actually to cover the various routes that the students are walking into the high school, and the ones, you know, a lot of people drop their kids off in the cars. So, you know, keep all that in mind. And then, you know, you do that a couple times, you might end up getting a teacher interested in being in contact and working with you. You know, living there, you find out, you know, more of the parents that have kids in the school that are willing to talk to you. And eventually, it's not going to happen right away, but over time, in the years ahead, you know, parents will raise with the school, hey, you know, these military recruiters are in there, they're doing their thing. Why can't the people that are opposed to the war, you know, have their point of view in there and have their tables? And, you know, after maybe a couple years, we were in the high school with a table during the lunch period, you know, getting our literature out there to the students as they come into lunch, and having a table for folks that are interested in coming up. We did eventually get into the classroom with people from the organization called Iraq Veterans Against the War, who would send people through on tours. They would be giving, you know, talks and classes inside the high school. Initially, I'd say about 10% of the students opted out from being contacted by the military recruiters. We got that up to about 60%. So we saw that as a big achievement. And the principal, not initially, but later on, was a colonel in the Army. His name was, I think it was Colonel Orlov. Right? And he left after a couple years. It seemed like we were making more progress than he was in the school. You know, even though you get 60% or more, you know, opting out, we were never able to get rid of JROTC. That's a tough nut to crack. Maybe other folks have had better luck with that, but they're still in there, you know, for the reasons that folks have outlined. They got the money, and we should do the best we can. I guess that's my message. And there's a lot of turnover as students graduate, you know, getting people in the school that are active. We were never able to maintain a consistent presence among students inside the high school. You know, I mean, I had a next door neighbor. The young guy got a $30,000 signing bonus to get into the Army. You know, so certainly he had a brand new you know, Honda Civic. I mean, that's hard to argue against. You know, I'm just saying that's what we're up against, what you all brought up earlier. But you know, I think overall it's a worthwhile effort. You do reach a lot of students. As a group, we don't do a whole lot these days. We have a barbecue during the summer, and we do the counter-recruitment thing in the fall. A lot of us, you know, you're looking at like almost 20 years now. Yeah, 20 years. You know, we get old. I mean, you get past middle age and you're not as, I don't know, you don't have the resilience. So that's something to consider, you know. I'll leave it, you know, those are some of the detailed and specifics. that can be accomplished. And I think in other areas, maybe more was accomplished, but this was this was a low income neighborhood. I mean, a lot of Spanish speaking folks, our group was bilingual, still is, quite frankly, but there aren't many of us left. And now we got 5 hotels that have gone up since we started, and the housing prices have shot up, and we're becoming or are more of a suburb than a working class community like we were 20 years ago. The world changes quite a bit. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, and it's good to keep in mind that this is, yeah, really meant to be kind of a long-term effort. And I mean, I think, yeah, part of the thing with high schools and just schools in general is that there is kind of that 4-year turnover rate. And I think that points to the fact that, like, it's, an opportunity because there's always new people coming in, but then it is also difficult to really form organization with people that are going to be leaving in 4 years. And so I think, yeah, it really can be a difficulty, but also I think, for example, various different clubs on schools are able to keep going. And I think that, if we're able to form some good organization to really kind of get students who also, want to bring in other students, because ultimately I think that, they're going to have much more success with that than we are, as, as outside from the school. That's really kind of the way that you're going to be able to do that. And I think it's probably helpful that some of us are a bit closer to high school age, but I think that it's great to also have people that have been doing this for a while and have a lot of experience.
Thought doing pamphlets outside the school sounded like a good thing too, in terms of getting ourselves started.
Where is the forum that's been created on that? We may interpret just recruiting to be connected to that, but military recruiters don't go into schools to talk about the military budget. So you could potentially be banned because you're not asking for access for the right forum, the right topic. So yeah, of course, that is just
Sorry,
one
who's
aspect
talking?
of militarism.
Where's the
But when it comes
audio
to
coming
youth
from?
outreach and doing
It's like a video.
counter-recruitment, you
Sorry,
have to
guys.
be
Sam,
a
I
little
think
more
Sam, I think you have a video on
thoughtful
and it's
about
not
the
muted
message.
for us.
okay.
I was like, "Hey,
confused.
there goes some confidence."
Someone talking.
I got Zoom bombed.
Yeah. Anyway, so we've been on for a little bit now, like almost nearing the 2-hour mark. It could be good to be wrapping up, but if there are other last kind of comments and thoughts, it'd be great to hear.
Yeah, one more thing. I think, along with Miles saying pamphlets outside of school, I guess one of the things to think about, I don't know what the capacity of this is, but maybe more in a medium long-term thinking is if there's what are youth I don't know if youth organizations need to be created or if there's youth organizations that already exist specifically for high schoolers, people under the age of 18 or whatnot. Maybe if you're doing it at a university, what are these youth organizations that we could tie them to if we're going to intervene, especially at the high school level? Because if they're facing this choice of what are they going to do in the next few years of their lives, et cetera, I don't know if creating a youth organization or trying to find local ones, depending on what city you're on, is something to be included into these counter-recruitment, anti-recruitment efforts. Just want to throw that out there as a point to think about.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think definitely, yeah, we should be looking into what organizations do exist, try to work with them as much as we can. And yeah, it's another way to kind of reach people in addition to going to the schools themselves. And probably, yeah, creating some in the more medium and term will be useful. But yeah, and then in addition to that, I think well, yeah, so like these sort of youth organizations, they can be more like have less of a turnover than say a high school, which is like a definite thing of 4 years. So that's also, I think, a useful thing. But then too, I think yeah, thinking in terms, I mean, yeah, youth organization and specifically like organization in the high schools, like of the students, is helpful. But also, yeah, I think we can be, aiming to, and not as an immediate thing. It's not going to be. It takes a while to build these things, but creating organization, also just amongst in the neighborhood, with the parents and with even people who may not have kids in high school, but did at some point and were concerned about it at one point, and so yeah, trying to yeah, I think there's kind of different creative ways in which we can be thinking about this, and in addition to kind of the youth organization and the high school kids themselves, and that can help things be longer lasting too, because it isn't so dependent on a particular cohort of people in the high school and and the turnover that exists there. If we can create some organization at the level of the neighborhoods and where these schools are at and stuff amongst the people, and yeah, that definitely, like, that's like not an easy thing. And then there will be some places where there'll be somewhat more openings to do so, and some places where it won't be so possible to do that in the moment, and it'll take some kind of investigation to kind of figure out where the openings to do that are, and yeah, and it's just like, I think a key thing for us to also grapple with the fact that, like, this will take yeah, investigation, some trial and error to figure out where the openings are, and to get right the trying to bring people together in these ways and create organization in these ways. But we have to be willing to yeah, do that hard work, and hearing about some of the efforts in the past and how they've kind of built over the course of years and stuff, I think is helpful to keep that perspective of, like, we have to we can't expect, like, things to just suddenly happen and magically. It takes some effort, and but yeah.
John just raised.
Yeah, just briefly, I'd like to mention one more thing. It's a question for the overall anti-war movement that we need to, I think, analyze and think about and discuss more, and that is from the standpoint of sovereignty and self-determination for the Ukraine. Is this war that the U.S. is waging as a proxy war really a just war? From my point of view, I mean, the overthrow of a democratically elected government that was it was sponsored by Washington, and that was in 2014. We got to think about stuff like that, whether when we come to the conclusion of what's just and what's not just in terms of a war. I don't think anybody here believes that the United States government has any concern for the sovereignty or the self-determination of the Ukrainian people. So I think we ought to be thinking about that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question.
Yeah.
Sam, do you want to?
No, sorry, Miles, you're good. I was just gonna say that I think, like Alonzo said, we have been talking for nearly 2 hours now, and probably does make sense to wrap up pretty shortly. So yeah, if anyone kind of had any last questions or comments, I think also the goal with this is to kind of continue these discussions. I think people sent emails out, and so they should expect kind of an email from us, kind of just, what are our next steps, and how can we kind of continue these conversations about kind of how to move forward with things. So I guess if anyone has any last thoughts.
Thanks for holding this space, and looking forward to hopefully communicating more in the future.
Sounds good.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you to everybody for coming. Will, your insights were very helpful, and